The restraint field will hold indefinitely, the Varreth officer said. No unaugmented organic has ever disrupted a Class 7 containment array. Tavish Greer said nothing. He had been having, by any honest accounting, a remarkably bad 72 hours. It had begun with a fuel cell failure somewhere past the Devon corridor, compounded itself into an emergency deceleration that left his transport drifting without vector lock, and concluded, if concluded was even the right word, which it wasn't, with his ship being pulled into a Varreth patrol sweep and himself being escorted, firmly but without excessive violence, into a containment room aboard a military cruiser whose name he couldn't read and whose crew he couldn't fully understand. The Varreth translator technology was good, not perfect. Tavish had caught approximately 80% of what the officer said. The remaining 20% was tonal nuance that the device converted into a flat affirmative, regardless of actual meaning, which he suspected was a significant gap in diplomatic situations. He had been in the containment field for 4 hours. He wasn't panicking. Tavish Greer did not, as a rule, panic. This wasn't a personality trait he was especially proud of. It had less to do with courage than with a particular kind of fatalism he'd developed. Across 11 years of working salvage and cargo runs through the outer fringe territories, where things went wrong on a reliable schedule, and the only useful response was to work the problem in front of you rather than the one you were afraid of. Right now, the problem in front of him was the containment field. A Class 7 array, the officer had said. Tavish rolled his shoulders slowly, feeling the field's resistance, that specific pressure, like moving through cold water that didn't move back. He'd encountered a Class 4 once, on a recovery job near Hessian Station. Class 4s were unpleasant. The officer's tone when describing a Class 7 had carried the particular flatness of someone stating an obvious fact, the way you'd explain to a child that fire was hot. Tavish pressed his wrist against the field boundary. The field hummed. He pressed slightly harder, not dramatically. Not with any particular intention, just the habitual, almost bored testing of someone who had spent a decade checking whether things were as solid as advertised. The hum changed pitch. He stopped, looked at the faint distortion where his skin met the containment barrier. The field was doing something he didn't have a technical framework to describe, shivering almost at the contact point. A very small shimmer, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Tavish was paying attention. He pressed again, slow and even, and the field gave. Not dramatically, not with any cinematic cascade of sparks or collapsing energy wall. It simply yielded, the way overstressed material gives under sustained pressure, a quiet, almost apologetic failure. The boundary dissolved in a roughly arm-width section, the shimmer expanding and then simply stopping. Tavish pulled his hand back immediately. He stood looking at the gap in the containment field with the expression of a man who had poked a wall expecting resistance and found the wall wasn't there. He had not intended to do that. He put his hack through the gap just to confirm it was real. It was. He could step through it. He could technically leave the containment room right now, walk down the corridor, and create a series of problems that he had absolutely no interest in creating. He pulled his hand back inside and sat down on the bench along the wall. When the door opened 10 minutes later, Tavish was sitting exactly where they had left him, hands resting on his knees, the gap in the containment field still quietly open beside him, and the field otherwise intact and humming. The officer who entered was not the one from before. She was taller, Varreth height variation, he'd learned, tracked closely with command rank, with the pale gray skin and the deeply set bioluminescent markings along her jawline that he'd come to understand indicated senior military caste. Her uniform was different from the patrol officers, more austere in some ways and more detailed in others, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room she entered. She stopped. She looked at the gap in the containment field. She looked at Tavish, sitting quietly on the bench inside the field with his hands on his knees. She looked at the gap again. "You are still inside," she said. Her translator was better than the other officers, less lag, almost no tonal flattening. Either a newer model or a custom calibration, which meant she dealt with non-Varreth communication often enough to have invested in quality. "I didn't think leaving would be helpful," Tavish said, "given the circumstances." A long pause. Her bioluminescent markings, the ones along her jaw, flickered very slightly, which he was reasonably sure indicated something, though he hadn't had enough Varreth exposure to know what. "How long has the boundary been compromised?" "About 10 minutes before you came in, and you remained." "I remained." She crossed the room slowly and stood at the gap looking at the disrupted field with a focused, technical attention that reminded him of the way experienced mechanics examined engine failures, not alarmed, just deeply interested in understanding what had happened and why. A Class 7 containment array, she said, almost to herself. The resonance tolerances are calibrated to the upper limit of any documented biological output. I didn't do anything unusual, Tavish said. I just pressed on it. I wasn't trying to break it. I was bored. She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read across the physiological gap between their species, but which contained, unmistakably, something that was at least in the same family as skepticism. You disrupted a Class 7 containment field because you were bored. I disrupted it by accident because I was testing whether it was actually as solid as advertised. I've been in a few containment situations. You develop habits. The markings along her jaw flickered again, longer this time. She reached into the gap and ran her hand across the boundary, her fingers moving through the disrupted section with careful attention. This is not a manufacturing defect, she said. I didn't think it was. And you are not augmented. Our initial scan confirmed unaugmented baseline biology. I'm not augmented, Tavish agreed. I'm a salvage operator from the Hessian fringe with a fuel cell problem and a delivery schedule that is becoming increasingly theoretical. She withdrew her hand from the gap and turned to face him fully. In the quality of her attention, the stillness of it, the focus, Tavish recognized a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that didn't move until it had decided something. I am Commander Varreth Vel, she said. I oversee military operations for this patrol sector. What you have just described and demonstrated does not fit any category in our operational framework. I understand. That's a problem. It is, at minimum, a significant administrative complication. A pause. May I ask your name? Tavish Greer. Independent salvage contractor, licensed out of Hessian Station, cargo registration HC7741. My ship's logs will confirm the fuel cell failure and the unintended vector drift into your patrol zone. None of this was planned. I believe you, she said. And she said it with the tone of someone who had made a specific decision. Unplanned incursions have a particular character. Deliberate ones also have a particular character. Yours is not the second kind. Something in Tavish's chest loosened fractionally. I appreciate that. Do not interpret it as a resolution, she said. You have disrupted a Class 7 containment array with your bare hands while bored, and you appear genuinely unaware of why this is possible. These are not circumstances that resolve quickly. How long are we talking? Long enough that I would recommend making yourself comfortable. She glanced at the bench. More comfortable than that bench, ideally. I'll have different quarters arranged. She turned to leave, then paused at the door with the particular quality of someone who has thought of a thing they're not entirely sure they should say. You could have left, she said without turning around. The gap has been there for 10 minutes. The corridor beyond that door is not heavily monitored at this hour. You chose to remain. I told you, I didn't think leaving would be helpful. No, she agreed quietly. But most beings, faced with an unexpected opening, go through it, even when going through it is not in their interest. A pause. That is its own kind of data point, Mr. Greer. She left. The door sealed behind her. Tavish sat in the containment room with the broken Class 7 field humming around him and thought about what she'd said. He decided it was probably a compliment. He was not entirely sure. The next 18 hours were, by Varreth military standards, apparently extraordinary. By Tavish's standards, they were exhausting. He was moved to actual quarters, small, austere, but functional, with a sleeping surface that accommodated human spine geometry better than he'd expected, and a water provision system that took him 20 minutes to figure out and worked well once he did. He was not restrained. 3 different scanning teams came through in rotation, each one carrying equipment he couldn't identify, and each one leaving with a specific expression of people who needed to have a longer conversation with their supervisors. Nobody was rude. Nobody was hostile. But there was a quality to the attention around him that Tavish recognized from salvage work. The careful, focused interest of people who have found something they cannot immediately categorize, and who have not yet decided whether it is valuable or dangerous. Commander Varreth Vel came back on the 4th visit, without scanning equipment, and sat across from him with the direct and slightly disconcerting quality of someone who has decided that indirect approaches are no longer worth the time. The preliminary analysis of the containment field disruption is complete, she said. And the 3 scientists who conducted it are in significant disagreement about the mechanism, but in full agreement about the outcome. She folded her hands on the table between them. The field did not fail. You interrupted its resonance frequency. The disruption propagated from the contact point outward, which is, from an engineering standpoint, not a thing an unaugmented biological organism should be capable of. I pressed on it, Tavish said. I didn't do anything technical. The effect was technical regardless of your intention. She studied him. Have you encountered situations like this before? Physical outcomes that surprised you? Tavish thought about this honestly. I've survived things I probably shouldn't have survived, he said slowly. Working salvage in the fringe, you accumulate a list. Pressure events. Atmospheric failures. Twice I was caught in drive wash from ships that didn't know I was working nearby. Standard exposure durations for those events would have caused significant injury. I was uncomfortable. I wasn't injured. You considered these coincidences. Fringe workers tend toward superstition. I never had a scientific framework for it. You have one now, pending further analysis. She looked at him steadily. At minimum, what we are observing suggests that your physical parameters, tolerances, output capacity, possibly cellular-level stress response, exist significantly outside documented human norms. How far outside the scientists cannot yet agree on, but outside. The room was very quiet. The ship's ambient system made a low-frequency sound that wasn't quite vibration and wasn't quite noise, just a constant presence. I'm a salvage operator, Tavish said. You are a salvage operator, Varreth Vel agreed. You are also apparently something that our entire accumulated xenobiological database has no adequate category for. She paused. I want to be clear that this is not a threatening observation. It is a genuinely uncertain one. How do you mean? I mean that in 17 years of military command, I have learned to recognize two kinds of things I do not understand. The first kind is a threat. It has a specific character, the way a situation feels when the unknown element is actively working against you. She looked at him calmly. The second kind is a mystery. It feels different. It is harder to manage in some ways because it doesn't have a clear protocol. But it is also... She stopped herself. Also what? She looked at him for a moment with that careful stillness that he'd come to associate with her making a decision. More interesting, she said. Considerably more interesting. Tavish felt something shift in the tone of the room that he couldn't precisely name. For what it's worth, Commander, I didn't plan any of this. The fuel cell, the drift, the containment field. I am genuinely just a person who ended up in your jurisdiction by accident and would very much like to make a late delivery to a supply depot in the Ocean Reach. The delivery will be arranged, she said. You have my word on that. Your ship's logs have been reviewed and confirmed. The technical fault is documented. You will not face legal consequence for the incursion. Thank you. The other matter, the physiological question, will take longer to resolve. She stood. The scientific team will want ongoing access. Not immediate, not compulsory. But consider it, he said, not agree to it. I don't compel cooperation with research. I've found it produces worse data. He looked at her. She said it without any particular inflection, but there was something in the phrasing, the pragmatic directness of it, that he found unexpectedly reassuring. I'll consider it, he said. Genuinely. She nodded once. At the door, she paused in the same way as before, with a particular quality of reconsidering something. The breach in the containment field, she said. When I came in, you were sitting on the bench, not near the gap. You had moved away from it. I sat back down after I confirmed it was real. Why? Tavish considered the question. He'd asked himself the same thing in the 10 minutes between discovering the gap and her arrival, and he'd arrived at an answer that felt honest even if it sounded reductive. Because walking through it would have started a different kind of situation, he said. And I was already in enough of a situation. Varreth Vel looked at him for a long moment, and her bioluminescent markings did the flickering thing again. Slower this time, more sustained. That is a very particular kind of judgment, she said. It's just common sense. Common sense, in my experience, is considerably less common than its name implies. She turned to go. Rest. The scientific team will contact you when they have consolidated their preliminary findings. Commander. She stopped. What does it mean? He asked. The markings, the jaw markings. When they do that. He gestured vaguely at his own jaw. You've done it 3 or 4 times in this conversation, and I don't have a reference for it. A pause. It is an involuntary physiological response, she said. It does not translate cleanly. Roughly. Another pause longer. Roughly, she said. It indicates the presence of something unexpected. Something that requires recalibration of existing assumptions. Is that good or bad? It is, she said carefully. Neither. It is the specific response to encountering a thing that does not fit the existing map. Whether the recalibration is good or bad depends entirely on what the new information turns out to mean. She left. Tavish sat in his quarters and thought about being a thing that didn't fit the existing map. He had been that, in various smaller ways, for most of his adult life. The salvage contractor who got to jobs nobody else wanted, who worked systems nobody monitored, who had a reputation built not on being exceptional but on being reliably present in places where nobody expected him to be. He had never thought of it as a category, just a life. The ship moved beneath him. The low ambient sound continued. Somewhere in this vessel, 3 scientists were in significant disagreement about what he was, and a commander with flickering jaw markings was recalibrating her assumptions. He thought about the containment field. He thought about the drive wash events, the pressure failures, the long list of things he had walked away from while being uncomfortable rather than dead. He thought about his fuel cell, which his ship's automated system had already flagged for parts that would need sourcing from a vendor he'd never used before. He decided to think about the fuel cell. It was at least a solvable problem. He was less certain about the rest. The scientific team's consolidated preliminary findings took 9 hours. Tavish used the time to sleep, genuinely, deeply, in the way that only became possible when the acute phase of a crisis had passed and the body caught up with the accumulated deficit, and to draft a message to the supply depot in the Ocean Reach, explaining the delay, which was the 6th such message he had sent to that depot in 3 years, and which they would receive with the resigned familiarity of a client who had learned to build buffer time into any arrangement involving Tavish Greer. He was not proud of his reputation for delays. He was realistic about it. The lead scientist was a small Varreth with markings Tavish hadn't seen before, clustered differently, denser, along the temples rather than the jaw, and an energy that read as excitement imperfectly contained by professional composure. Her name, according to the translator, was something that rendered as approximately resonant discovery, which Tavish suspected was a very rough approximation of something more specific in Varreth. She told him to call her Res. He did. "We have 4 areas of significant anomaly," Res said, arranging her data display with the contained enthusiasm of someone who has found what might be the most interesting thing in their career. "I will be direct with you. Please. Your cellular stress response is operating at a tolerance threshold that is, by human biological standards as we understand them, not possible. When tissue is placed under physical stress, pressure, force, temperature variance, the typical cascade of cellular distress signals occurs at a certain threshold. Yours does not begin until significantly later." What does that mean practically? It means that what would damage most organisms begins registering in your biology as a signal worth responding to considerably later in the process. Your body does not send distress signals early. It waits, assesses, and responds. She tilted her head. "In a design system, we would call that a hardened architecture. I wasn't designed. No. But something in your development produced an analogous outcome." She moved to the next data point. "Second anomaly, your musculoskeletal force generation. We were able to measure output in the contained environment. You are generating approximately 4 times what human biological literature, and we acknowledge our database is limited. Documents as typical for your size and build, 4 times. When you disrupted the containment field. Yes, we can see the force propagation in the field's own sensor logs. It is quite clear." Tavish looked at his hands. They were, to all visible evidence, exactly the hands he had always had. Scarred from salvage work. Calloused in the specific way that came from grip tools and pressure environments. With a crooked middle finger on his left hand from a break that had been set by someone who was more confident than skilled. They did not look like hands that broke Class 7 containment fields. "Is this something I should know about myself?" he asked. "In terms of day-to-day management." Res looked at him with the specific expression of a scientist encountering a question they had not prepared for. "We do not yet know enough to advise you," she said honestly. "What we can say is that if you have lived with these parameters for any significant time, you have likely developed unconscious compensatory behavior, calibrating your own force output, adjusting your physical interactions with the world around you in ways you don't consciously register." Tavish thought about this. He thought about the handshakes he kept slightly loose. The cargo he always lifted with a touch more care than his colleagues thought was necessary. The careful way he'd learned, very young and after one specific bad incident he did not think about often, to manage his grip when he was angry. "I might have," he said. "The containment field was likely a situation where the unconscious calibration encountered an unusual variable," Res said. "The field's resistance pattern would have read differently to your physical sensing systems than conventional material resistance. The calibration may have overcorrected, so I wasn't trying to break it. No. We believe you were trying to determine how solid it was, and your attempt to answer that question produced an output your own system did not anticipate. This was, Tavish thought, a remarkably accurate description of how the whole event had felt from the inside. What are the other two anomalies? He asked. The third is metabolic, Ress said. Your recovery rate from physical stress events is accelerated. We induced a minor stress response, with your consent, retrospectively, as the containment event itself provided adequate data, and observed a cellular recovery cycle roughly 3 times faster than documented human norms. And the fourth? Ress paused. It was a specific kind of pause, the kind that precedes information the person sharing it hasn't fully decided how to frame. Your neurological response to threat assessment, she said. The brain activity patterns we observed during the containment situation, reconstructed from the monitoring systems in that room, show an unusual configuration. Most organisms exhibit a specific escalating pattern during unexpected threat assessment. Stress hormones, decision acceleration, fear response overlays on rational processing. Yours does not show that pattern. What pattern does it show? A very quiet one, Ress said, almost conversational, as if your threat assessment system and your rational processing system are not the same thing, but not in conflict, as if they have learned to work in parallel rather than one overriding the other. The room was quiet. You are saying I don't panic, Tavish said. We are saying, Ress said carefully, that your neurological architecture does not appear to have the standard infrastructure for it. Tavish sat with this for a moment. Is that useful to know, he said. It may explain a great deal about your survival history, Ress said, and it may explain why, when you found a gap in a Class 7 containment field, you went back to the bench and sat down. Commander Varreth Vel came to see him one more time before his release, which took 2 full days to process through the appropriate authorization chains, a pace she acknowledged, without apparent embarrassment, was faster than normal and slower than she would have preferred. She came without a data display or a scientific companion. She came with the quality of someone making a personal visit rather than an official one, which Tavish understood to be a meaningful distinction in Varreth culture, because every Varreth he had interacted with on this vessel treated the difference between official and personal as significant enough to be worth signaling clearly. Your ship's parts have been sourced, she said. The fuel cell assembly is compatible. My engineers have offered to conduct the replacement, which will save you approximately 2 days of labor. You didn't need to do that, no, she agreed. We also did not need to keep you for 2 days while the administration processed your release, so it seemed like a reasonable offset. I appreciate it. She sat, which was different from all the previous visits where she had stood. It seemed like a decision. Ress tells me you received the full preliminary briefing, she said. I did, and Tavish thought about how to answer that honestly. Mostly I'm still processing it, he said. 11 years of attributing things to luck, and apparently some of it wasn't luck. That takes time to sit with. Not yet. Ask me in a month. Varreth Vel nodded. Her jaw markings flickered, brief and quiet. The scientific team will want to establish contact for ongoing study, she said. I have told them that it will be on your terms. Timing, location, extent of access. You are not an asset or a subject, you are, she paused. A collaborator if you choose to be, and if I choose not to be. Then you are a salvage contractor who had a fuel cell problem, made an unintentional incursion into Varreth patrol space, and encountered an administrative delay that has since been resolved. She looked at him steadily. The choice is genuinely yours. I want that to be clear. It's clear, Tavish said. I'll think about it. I expected nothing less. He looked at her, the measured intelligence of her, the particular quality of attention she'd maintained throughout every interaction, the jaw markings that apparently indicated the experience of having assumptions recalibrated. Can I ask you something? Yes. In 17 years of military command, he said, how many situations have you encountered that you couldn't categorize? She considered this. Several, she said. Fewer than you might expect. Military experience produces a wide category system. But some, what happened to them? The uncategorizable ones. She was quiet for a moment. Some resolved into existing categories once enough information was available, she said. They were strange only because they were incomplete. A pause. Some did not resolve. They required the construction of new categories, and the ones that required new categories. Varreth Vel looked at him with the steadiness that he had come to recognize as her particular kind of honesty. Those were the ones I remember, she said, the ones that changed the shape of what I knew. The room held the quiet between them for a moment. I'll agree to the study, Tavish said. On my terms. I'll let Ress know. One condition she waited. You're present for the first session, he said. I work better with a consistent point of contact, and you're the one who's been honest with me throughout this. The jaw markings flickered, slower than before, more sustained. That is an unusual request, she said. I know, I will consider it. Consider, he said. Not agree to. Something in her expression shifted, not a smile, not exactly, but a kind of precision in the stillness of it that he was beginning to read as the Varreth equivalent of one. You learn quickly, she said. Salvage work, he said. You adapt or you don't last. She stood to leave. At the door, and by now he recognized this pattern, the pause at the door, the reconsideration, the thing said on the threshold that wouldn't have been said across a table, she stopped. For the record, she said. I will be present. I had already decided before you asked. Tavish said nothing. I am documenting this entire incident as a Category 1 anomalous contact, she continued. The classification requires senior officer continuity throughout the investigation period. A pause. This is a formal administrative rationale. Of course, Tavish said. It is. Say it. She left. The door sealed with its quiet mechanical finality. Tavish sat in the small Varreth quarters that had, over 2 days, accumulated the minor evidence of habitation, a jacket folded on the sleeping surface, a water vessel he'd moved to within easier reach, a scratch on the table edge from a moment of inattentive handling, and thought about the Category 1 anomalous contact report that would be filed under his name in the Varreth military database. He thought about being a thing that required new categories. He thought about 11 years of fringe work, and the long list of things he had survived by being present in places where nobody expected him, dealing with problems in front of him rather than the ones he was afraid of, and going back to the bench instead of through the gap. He thought about the fuel cell which was being replaced by Varreth engineers who were by all accounts extremely precise. 3 days later the delivery to the Ocean Reach Depot arrived late. Everything else, the study agreement, the Category 1 classification, the ongoing contact with a Varreth Commander, whose jaw markings flickered when she encountered things that didn't fit the existing map, arrived exactly when it was supposed to.